Have you ever received a phone call that made your blood run cold? What if that call came every night at exactly midnight, whispering secrets only you could know? That's exactly what happened to Amanda, a seemingly ordinary young woman whose life spiraled into a nightmare she could never escape. Tonight, we'll delve into her chilling tale, where every ring of the phone pulled her deeper into an abyss of terror and despair. But before we get to the bone-chilling details, take a moment to subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and turn on notifications. Trust me, you'll want to stay connected for what's coming next. Now let's begin. The story unfolds on a quiet, moonlit night. Amanda sat alone in her apartment, scrolling through her phone, the soft hum of city lights filtering through her window. The air was heavy with an eerie stillness, the kind that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the sharp, jarring ring of her landline. She froze. Who could be calling at this hour? Her hand trembled as she reached for the phone. "Hello," she whispered, her voice barely audible. At first, there was nothing but static, a low hum that grew louder, almost alive, like a swarm of bees trapped inside the receiver. Then a voice, cold, mechanical, and unrecognizable, broke through. "Amanda," it rasped, drawing out her name like a hiss. She gasped, her pulse racing. "Who is this?" she demanded, but the voice continued, ignoring her question. "Do you remember the doll you buried in the garden when you were 7? Her breath hitched. "No one knew about that. No one." She slammed the phone down, her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to dismiss it as a cruel prank, but the unease lingered. The feeling of being watched crept over her, as though a pair of unseen eyes were studying her every move. She locked her doors and windows, telling herself it was just her imagination. But deep down, she knew something was terribly, horribly wrong. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching into an eternity. As the clock struck 12:15, she realized she was gripping the phone, her knuckles white. The room felt colder, the shadows deeper. Somewhere outside, the wind howled like a mournful cry. And then she heard it, a faint whisper, not from the phone, but from the walls themselves. Amanda, was it paranoia, or was something sinister reaching out to her? The answer would come soon enough, and it would be far more horrifying than she ever imagined. The second night began innocently enough. Amanda, still shaken from the mysterious phone call, convinced herself it had been a cruel prank. She distracted herself with mundane tasks, dishes, laundry, the humdrum rituals of normalcy. Yet, no matter how hard she tried, the memory of that voice clung to her, an invasive presence in her thoughts. The house felt different. The air was heavier, carrying an unplaceable scent, something metallic and faintly sweet, like rusted iron. The clock on her wall ticked louder than usual, each second hammering into her nerves like a drumbeat. As midnight approached, Amanda sat curled on her couch, gripping a cup of tea that had long gone cold. Her eyes flicked nervously to the clock, 11:59. Her breath quickened, and she tried to laugh at herself, her voice brittle in the oppressive silence. But as the digital clock clicked over to 12 o'clock, her world shattered. The phone rang. The sound cut through the quiet like a blade. Sharp, loud, relentless. It was the same as the night before. Her landline, a device she rarely used and never gave much thought to. Amanda stared at it, her body frozen with dread. The ringing continued, unyielding, demanding her attention. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. Part of her screamed to ignore it, but something deeper, a pull she couldn't explain, forced her hand. She lifted the receiver. "Amanda," the voice was the same as before, low and mechanical, each syllable dripping with malice. She wanted to hang up but found herself paralyzed, unable to move, as though the voice had rooted her to the spot. "Tomorrow," it continued, "you will see red." Her heart raced. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" she shouted into the receiver, but the voice didn't answer. Instead, there was a sound, a faint, wet noise like the squelching of something being dragged across a damp surface. Then came the laughter. Hollow, echoing, utterly inhuman. Amanda slammed the phone down, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The house seemed to respond. The shadows on the walls grew darker, almost liquid in their movement. The metallic scent intensified, filling her nostrils. The lights flickered, their hum becoming an unnerving whine. Then, for the briefest moment, everything fell silent. But silence was worse than the noise. In the void of sound, Amanda swore she heard a faint whisper behind her. She turned abruptly, but there was nothing there, only the empty, dimly lit room. Still, the feeling of being watched persisted, stronger now, as if the very walls were alive with unseen eyes. Her stomach churned with unease. She double-checked the locks on her windows and doors, barricading herself in her bedroom. But even as she lay under the covers, the echoes of that voice replayed in her mind. Tomorrow you will see red. Her sleep was restless, filled with fractured dreams of dark corridors and a phone endlessly ringing in the distance. Each time she tried to answer it in her dream, the walls would close in around her, suffocating her in darkness. She woke with a start just before dawn, her body drenched in cold sweat. Her first thought was relief. It was just a dream. But when she looked at her hands, she froze. They were smeared with red. Blood? No. It was paint. The walls of her bedroom were covered in words, smeared in crimson strokes, midnight, repeated over and over again. Her phone sat on the bedside table, silent now, but its presence loomed large. She realized, with mounting dread, that the nightmare had only just begun. Amanda's third night began with an unsettling awareness that something was waiting for her. The day had passed in a haze. She avoided the phone, avoided mirrors, even avoided her own shadow. Every glance over her shoulder, every creak of the floorboards sent chills down her spine. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, a sense of inevitability crept in. Midnight was coming, and with it, the call. She spent the evening pacing her apartment, locking and unlocking her doors compulsively, as if trying to convince herself of her safety. Outside, the wind howled, pressing against the windows like an unseen force eager to get in. The room felt colder than usual, and the strange metallic smell from the night before returned, stronger, cloying. She opened all the windows in desperation, but the air outside was as still and dead as her growing sense of dread. As the clock struck 11:50, Amanda lit every lamp in her apartment, the warm glow chasing away the oppressive shadows. But it didn't help. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, as though reaching toward her. She heard faint sounds, soft whispers, the scratch of nails on glass, but couldn't pinpoint their origin. Her phone sat on the kitchen counter, silent for now, but radiating a malevolent presence. She found herself staring at it, unable to look away, waiting for it to come alive. 11:59. The moment stretched unbearably, every tick of the clock a deafening roar in her ears. She clutched the edge of the counter, her knuckles white, her breath shallow. Then, at the precise moment the clock turned to 12 o'clock, it rang. The sound was louder than it had been the previous nights, almost thunderous, reverberating through the walls of the apartment. It was as if the phone demanded her attention, as if it would never stop until she answered. Amanda approached the phone slowly, each step weighted with an invisible force. Her heart pounded so violently it felt as though it would burst. The ringing continued, relentless, merciless. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers brushing the cold plastic. The air around her seemed to thrum with energy, the shadows quivering in anticipation. Finally, she picked up the receiver. The line was silent at first, thick with static. Then the voice returned, low and guttural, each word dripping with malice. "Why do you run, Amanda?" it asked, the tone almost mocking. "You can't hide from what's already inside." She stammered a response, her voice cracking under the weight of her terror. "What do you want from me?" she screamed. The voice didn't answer. Instead, there was a sound, different this time. A faint, rhythmic tapping, like footsteps echoing in a distant hallway. The noise grew louder, closer, until it seemed to come from inside her apartment. Amanda's eyes darted frantically around the room, but she saw nothing. "Do you hear it, Amanda?" the voice whispered, amused. "It's coming for you." The phone slipped from her hand, crashing to the floor. The tapping continued, relentless, now accompanied by a faint dragging sound, as if something heavy was being pulled across the floor. Amanda backed away, her eyes fixed on the dark hallway leading to her bedroom. The lights in the apartment flickered, the shadows dancing unnaturally, their shapes twisting and stretching. Then she saw it, a figure at the end of the hallway. It was barely visible, a silhouette darker than the shadows around it. It didn't move but seemed to watch her, its presence suffocating. Amanda's breath came in ragged gasps, her body frozen with terror. The tapping and dragging sound stopped abruptly, replaced by a chilling silence. The figure took a step forward. Amanda bolted, grabbing the phone from the floor as she ran to her front door. But the locks, the ones she had checked and double-checked, refused to budge. She clawed at the door, screaming for help, but her voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. Behind her, the figure moved closer, its shape shifting and warping as it advanced. She turned, pressing herself against the door, clutching the phone like a lifeline. "Midnight," the voice on the phone whispered, though the receiver wasn't against her ear. The voice was inside the room now, surrounding her, suffocating her with its presence. It's where it all begins. The figure loomed over her now, close enough that she could feel the icy chill radiating from it. Amanda squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the end. But when she opened them, the figure was gone. The lights were back to normal, the shadows no longer moving. The phone, still in her hand, was silent. Amanda collapsed to the floor, her body trembling uncontrollably. She thought the nightmare had passed. But on the wall opposite her, written in dripping red letters, were the words, "You can't hide." The fourth night was unlike any other. Amanda had barely slept, her mind consumed by the events of the previous nights. Every creak, every shadow, every fleeting sound made her jump. She had unplugged the landline, hoping to silence its calls, but the anticipation gnawed at her. Midnight was coming, and she knew deep down that the phone would ring, no matter what she did. By 11:30, the atmosphere in her apartment had shifted entirely. The air felt dense, thick with an almost suffocating heaviness. Amanda lit every lamp she owned, but the light seemed muted, swallowed by an unnatural gloom that clung to the corners of each room. She sat on the edge of her couch, gripping her cell phone tightly, her only source of comfort. Outside, the wind howled, carrying a low, mournful whistle that seemed to circle her building, almost as if it were searching for a way inside. 11:59, Amanda glanced at the clock. Her heart raced, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She clutched her cell phone tighter, her knuckles turning white. Then, as the clock struck 12 o'clock, the landline, unplugged and lifeless, began to ring. The sound was deafening, louder than ever before, as if it were vibrating through the very walls. Amanda stared at the phone, paralyzed. Her rational mind screamed that it was impossible, but her instincts told her that the impossible had no place here. The ringing persisted, relentless, growing sharper, as if slicing through her sanity. Her cell phone slipped from her trembling hands, hitting the floor with a dull thud. Against her better judgment, Amanda stood and moved toward the landline. The air around it seemed distorted, shimmering as if waves of heat emanated from it. Her hand hovered over the receiver, the memory of the voice's haunting words echoing in her mind. "It's already inside." Finally, as though compelled by an unseen force, she answered. "What do you want from me?" she cried, her voice cracking under the weight of her fear. The voice on the other end was no longer a whisper. It was a cacophony, a dozen voices layered together, some screaming, others laughing, and some speaking in a language Amanda couldn't understand. The sound was overwhelming, like nails on a chalkboard inside her skull. Then, amidst the chaos, one voice cut through, clear and cold. "Look behind you." Amanda's blood ran cold. Her grip on the phone tightened, her body frozen in place. The shadows around her began to shift, crawling across the walls like living creatures. Slowly, against every instinct screaming at her not to, she turned. What she saw defied explanation. A figure stood in the center of her living room, tall and unnaturally thin, its limbs elongated and twisted at impossible angles. Its face was featureless, but from where its eyes should have been, two deep, empty voids seemed to pull at her, dragging her into their darkness. Its presence radiated an overwhelming sense of malice, the kind that burrows into your soul and leaves you hollow. Amanda dropped the phone, her breath hitching in her throat. The figure began to move, its jerky, unnatural motions accompanied by the faint sound of bones cracking. It raised one long, claw-like finger and pointed at her. The room erupted into chaos. The lights exploded one by one, plunging the apartment into darkness. Amanda stumbled backward, the glass crunching under her bare feet as she fought to find her balance. The metallic smell was back, stronger than ever, filling her lungs with every ragged breath. Suddenly, the voice returned, not from the phone, but from everywhere, surrounding her, invading her mind. "You can't escape. Midnight is ours." In a panic, Amanda ran, her only thought to get out of the apartment. She fumbled with the locks, her fingers slick with sweat, but they wouldn't budge. Behind her, the figure drew closer, its movements accompanied by the sound of wet, dragging footsteps. She screamed, pounding on the door, but no one answered. Then, just as the figure's shadow loomed over her, there was a blinding flash of light. For a brief moment, the room was bathed in searing white, and Amanda felt herself falling. The sensation was disorienting, as if the ground had been ripped from beneath her. She landed hard, the breath knocked from her lungs. When she opened her eyes, she was no longer in her apartment. She was standing in an endless void, surrounded by nothingness. The figure stood before her, its featureless face inches from her own. Its hand reached out, brushing her cheek with a claw-like finger that felt like ice against her skin. "You answered," it whispered, its voice dripping with satisfaction. Now you belong to us." Amanda's screams echoed into the void as the figure engulfed her, its shadow consuming her completely. And then silence. The phone in her apartment stopped ringing. The clock reset to 12:01, and the room was empty. Amanda was gone. All that remained was the phone, sitting on the shattered glass, waiting for its next victim. Amanda woke up with a start. At least, she thought she had. She found herself lying on the cold floor of her apartment, the faint smell of burnt wires filling the air. Her head throbbed, and her vision was blurry, but as her eyes adjusted, she realized something was wrong. The furniture in her living room was out of place, slightly skewed, as though someone had moved it while she was unconscious. The shattered glass from the broken light bulbs was gone, and the room was eerily pristine. Her phone, however, lay exactly where she had dropped it, its silence as menacing as the calls had been. It was 3 a.m. How had hours passed without her noticing? The last thing she remembered was the figure looming over her, the feeling of falling into an endless void. Was it a dream? A hallucination? Her mind grasped for an explanation, but deep down, she knew it was something far worse. Amanda stumbled to her feet, her knees weak and shaking. The air in the room felt oppressive, heavy with an unnatural stillness. She needed answers. Her gaze landed on the phone, and despite her better judgment, she picked it up. No dial tone, just static. But beneath the crackling noise, she could hear faint whispers. The voices were too soft to decipher, but their tone was unmistakably sinister. Driven by desperation, Amanda decided to investigate. She grabbed her laptop and began searching for any clue that could explain the calls. She typed in the phone number that had haunted her nights, expecting nothing. But to her surprise, a result appeared. It was a news article, dated 20 years ago, about a woman named Evelyn Harper. The article detailed how Evelyn had been found dead in her apartment, clutching a phone receiver in her hand. The cause of death was never determined, but neighbors reported hearing strange noises coming from her apartment the night before. Laughter, crying, and what sounded like multiple voices arguing. Evelyn's phone number matched the one that had been calling Amanda. Her heart sank as she read further. The police had declared the apartment cursed after multiple tenants reported eerie occurrences, from disembodied whispers to objects moving on their own. Amanda's blood ran cold. Her own address was listed as Evelyn's apartment. Panic set in as Amanda realized she wasn't dealing with an ordinary haunting. She was part of something bigger, something darker. She dug deeper into Evelyn's story, uncovering old police reports and grainy photos of the scene. One detail stood out, a red scrawl on the walls of Evelyn's apartment. It read, "You answered," the same message that had appeared in Amanda's living room. But it didn't end there. Amanda discovered a pattern. Every tenant who moved into the apartment after Evelyn reported receiving calls at midnight. Some claimed the calls stopped after a few nights, but others were never heard from again. The most disturbing part? The article noted that those who disappeared often reported seeing a figure in their dreams before vanishing. Amanda's heart pounded as she connected the dots. The figure, the calls, the whispers, they were all tied to something far more sinister than she had imagined. Her thoughts raced. Was Evelyn's death an accident, or had she become the victim of something that now targeted Amanda? And why hadn't anyone warned her before she moved in? As she scrolled through more records, Amanda's laptop screen flickered. The screen froze for a moment, then turned black. She tapped the keyboard frantically, but nothing happened. Suddenly, text began to appear on the screen, one keystroke at a time, as though someone or something was typing. "You should have let it ring." Amanda shoved the laptop away, her chest tightening with fear. She bolted to the window, hoping to see signs of life outside, but the street was deserted. The wind howled, and the shadows of tree branches swayed menacingly. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing under the street lamp, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. She blinked, and it was gone. Turning back to the room, Amanda froze. Her phone was ringing again. This time, it wasn't the landline, it was her cell phone. The screen glowed brightly, displaying a caller ID she couldn't ignore. Unknown. Her trembling hands reached for the phone as it rang louder and louder, each chime echoing through the apartment like a death knell. She hesitated, then pressed the answer button. "Hello," she whispered. There was no voice this time, only the sound of breathing, deep and labored. Then came the faint noise of tapping, like fingernails drumming on glass. Her eyes darted to the mirror on the wall, and her heart stopped. The reflection wasn't hers. It was Evelyn's face staring back at her, her eyes wide, mouth twisted in a silent scream. The phone slipped from Amanda's hand, and the reflection began to move, stepping closer to the glass. Amanda backed away, her legs nearly giving out beneath her. The reflection's lips moved, mouthing words Amanda couldn't hear. Then, with an ear-piercing crack, the mirror shattered, the shards flying toward her like razors. She ducked, covering her face, and when she looked up, the mirror was whole again. Her own reflection stared back at her, but her expression didn't match the terror she felt. It was smiling. The phone on the floor began ringing once more. Amanda was unraveling. Each call, each shadow, each inexplicable event chipped away at her sanity. She was no longer sure where her nightmares ended and reality began. The events of the previous night, her reflection smiling back at her, the shattered mirror that somehow repaired itself, played on a loop in her mind. She had to find answers, but every step she took seemed to lead her deeper into the labyrinth of terror that now consumed her life. That evening, Amanda decided she couldn't face another night alone. She reached out to Claire, her best friend and one of the few people who knew about her struggles. Reluctantly, Claire agreed to come over, though Amanda could hear the skepticism in her voice. "It's just stress," Claire had said. But Amanda knew this was far beyond anything that could be rationalized. Claire arrived just before midnight, armed with a bottle of wine and an attempt at optimism. "All right," she said, setting the bottle down on the table. "Let's prove this is just your overactive imagination." Amanda wanted to believe her, but the dread in her chest told her otherwise. Midnight was coming, and with it, the call. At 11:50, the lights in the apartment began to flicker. Claire laughed nervously, blaming faulty wiring, but Amanda was too tense to respond. She sat frozen, staring at the clock as it ticked closer to the hour. Claire noticed her friend's fear and tried to distract her. "Look, if it happens, we'll handle it together, okay?" she said, giving Amanda's hand a reassuring squeeze. 11:59. The room grew colder, and the oppressive metallic scent returned, stronger than ever. Claire wrinkled her nose. "What is that smell?" she asked, but Amanda couldn't answer. Her eyes were glued to the landline, now dark and silent. Then, as the clock struck midnight, the phone rang. Claire jumped, her confidence shattered by the piercing sound. Amanda stood, trembling, her eyes wide with terror. "Don't answer it," Claire said firmly, but Amanda couldn't stop herself. She walked to the phone as if drawn by an unseen force. Her hand shook as she lifted the receiver. "Amanda." The voice was colder than before, dripping with malice. "You brought a guest. That was unwise." Amanda gasped, dropping the receiver, and turned to Claire, whose face had gone pale. "What did it say?" Claire asked, her voice quivering. But before Amanda could respond, the lights went out, plunging the apartment into darkness. The silence was deafening. Amanda fumbled for her phone to use as a flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on. Claire whispered, "Amanda? What's happening?" Her voice cracked with fear. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the hallway, followed by the sound of dragging footsteps. Both women froze, the noise growing closer with each passing second. Amanda clutched Claire's arm, her nails digging into her skin. "We have to leave," she whispered. But as they moved toward the door, it slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. The dragging sound was now inside the apartment, accompanied by a low, guttural growl that made the air vibrate. The shadows in the room began to move, twisting and coiling like smoke. Out of the darkness, a figure emerged. Its limbs were long and distorted, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its featureless face turned toward them, and the growl turned into a chilling, otherworldly laugh. Claire screamed, grabbing Amanda's hand and pulling her toward the kitchen. "There's another door," she yelled, but as they ran, the figure followed, its movements jerky and inhuman. The metallic scent grew unbearable, filling their lungs and making them cough. In the kitchen, the second door was locked, though Amanda swore she had left it open earlier. Claire frantically searched for something to use as a weapon, grabbing a knife from the counter. "Stay back," she screamed at the figure, though it showed no fear. Instead, it moved closer, its shadow stretching unnaturally across the walls. The voice from the phone returned, not from the receiver but from all around them, echoing inside their heads. "There's no escape, Amanda. Midnight always comes." The figure lunged, and Claire swung the knife wildly, but it passed through the creature as though it were made of smoke. The figure grabbed Claire's wrist, its touch freezing her skin, and she cried out in pain. Amanda screamed, grabbing a chair and hurling it at the creature, but it shattered against the wall. The figure's void-like face turned toward Amanda, and she felt her knees buckle under the weight of its gaze. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stopped. It released Claire, who collapsed to the floor, clutching her wrist. The voice returned, softer now, almost a whisper. "Amanda, the choice is yours. Her life or yours." Amanda froze, her heart pounding. "What do you mean?" she stammered. The voice laughed, a sound that made her blood run cold. "One of you must stay. The other will be free. Choose." Claire looked at Amanda, tears streaming down her face. "Don't listen to it. We can get out of this together," she pleaded. But Amanda could feel the weight of the ultimatum. The figure loomed over them, waiting, its presence suffocating. As the clock ticked toward 12:01, Amanda realized the truth. Midnight was not just a time, it was a judgment, a moment when something ancient and malevolent decided the fate of those it ensnared. The choice was hers, but no matter what she decided, the terror would never truly end. Her voice shaking, Amanda whispered her decision. The clock struck 12:01, and the room was plunged into silence. Only one of them remained. The phone on the counter rang again, waiting for its next victim. Amanda stood alone in the apartment, her body trembling, her mind reeling from what she had just done. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of the fridge in the kitchen. Claire was gone. Not dead, no, that would have been merciful, but gone. Vanished into the void, into whatever nightmare realm the entity had claimed as its own. Amanda could still hear her friend's scream echoing in her mind, a haunting reminder of the impossible choice she had been forced to make. The air in the apartment felt heavier than ever, thick with an oppressive weight that pressed down on Amanda's chest, making it hard to breathe. The lights flickered weakly, casting long, jagged shadows across the room. She wanted to run, to scream, but her legs felt rooted to the floor. The entity's voice echoed around her once more, soft and mocking. "You chose wisely, Amanda. But it's not over. What do you want from me?" she yelled, her voice cracking with desperation. The shadows on the walls began to move again, swirling and twisting, forming shapes that seemed almost human but not quite. Their movements were unnatural, jerky, like broken marionettes controlled by invisible strings. The metallic smell returned, stronger than ever, making her gag. The voice chuckled, a deep, guttural sound that resonated through the walls. "What do I want?" "Amanda, you already know. I want you to understand." "Understand what?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The apartment grew darker, the walls seemingly closing in around her. The shadows on the walls began to stretch, creeping toward her like living entities. From the corner of her eye, she saw movement. Slowly, she turned toward the hallway leading to her bedroom. At the end of the hallway stood the figure, its body a mass of undulating darkness, its limbs elongated and grotesque. Its face, still blank and featureless, tilted slightly, as if studying her. "Understand what it means to be mine," the voice hissed. The figure began to move forward, each step accompanied by the sound of wet, dragging footsteps. Amanda backed away, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. She stumbled over the coffee table, falling to the floor, but the figure didn't stop. It towered over her now, its presence suffocating, the temperature in the room plummeting to an icy chill. Desperate, Amanda scrambled to her feet and ran to the bedroom, slamming the door shut behind her. She pushed the dresser against it, her hands shaking violently. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't stop the entity. She could hear it outside the door, the sound of its claws scratching against the wood, a slow, deliberate rhythm that sent shivers down her spine. Then, the whispers began again. They came from everywhere, inside the walls, from beneath the floorboards, even from inside her own head. They weren't words, just sounds, a cacophony of inhuman voices that seemed to be taunting her, mocking her fear. Amanda clapped her hands over her ears, sinking to the floor as tears streamed down her face. "You can't hide, Amanda," the voice said, clearer now, as if it were right next to her. "This is your fate. You belong to me." Suddenly, the room went silent. Amanda's hands fell from her ears, and she opened her eyes. The door was still shut, the dresser still in place. For a moment, she thought it was over. But then she saw it, the mirror on the wall. Her reflection stared back at her, but it wasn't her reflection. The woman in the mirror was smiling, her eyes glowing faintly with a sickly yellow light. Amanda stumbled backward, her breath catching in her throat. The reflection raised its hand, even though Amanda hadn't moved, and pointed toward the bed. Amanda turned slowly, her entire body shaking with dread. The bed was empty, but something was wrong. The blankets were perfectly smooth, untouched, but the indent of a body was clearly visible, as if someone, or something, was lying there, waiting for her. The voice returned, soft and sinister. "Do you see it now?" The truth you've been avoiding? No, Amanda whispered, shaking her head. This isn't real. This isn't real. Oh, it's very real, the voice said, almost laughing. You've been marked, Amanda. The moment you answered the phone, you let me in. Midnight was just the beginning. The figure emerged from the shadows in the corner of the room, its body twisting unnaturally as it moved toward her. Amanda backed against the wall, her hands clawing at the plaster as if she could tear her way out. Why me? She screamed. Why are you doing this to me? The figure stopped inches from her face, its blank visage tilting again, almost in amusement. Because you answered, it said simply. And now, you'll never escape. The room dissolved into darkness, the walls, the floor, the very air around her disappearing. Amanda felt herself falling, her screams swallowed by the void. When she opened her eyes, she was back in her apartment, sitting on the couch. The lights were on, the air was still, and the clock on the wall read 12:01. Everything seemed normal, except for the phone on the coffee table, its receiver off the hook. From it, she could hear faint whispers, just loud enough to understand. Midnight comes again, Amanda. Soon. She reached for the phone, compelled to put it back on the hook, but as her fingers touched it, the whispers turned to laughter. The line went dead, leaving her in silence once more. But Amanda knew the truth now. Midnight would come again, and next time, there would be no escape. Amanda's apartment was silent, but it was not the comforting kind of silence. It was the oppressive, unnatural stillness that made every creak of the floorboards feel like a scream in the void. The clock on the wall ticked softly, a stark reminder that time marched forward, no matter how frozen Amanda felt in her terror. It was 12:10 a.m. Midnight had passed, this time, but Amanda knew it was far from over. She sat on the floor, her back pressed against the wall, clutching her knees to her chest. Her body trembled, not just from fear but from the cold that seemed to have seeped into her bones. The air still carried the faint metallic tang, a smell she had come to associate with the entity's presence. Her eyes darted around the room, scanning every shadow, every corner, every mirror, waiting for something, anything to move. The phone sat on the coffee table, silent now, but its presence was suffocating. It felt alive, as though it were watching her, waiting for her to drop her guard. The receiver was still slightly off the hook, tilted just enough to remind her that the connection had never really ended. She couldn't bring herself to touch it, afraid that the whispers would start again, or worse. Amanda's mind raced. Why her? Why this apartment? She thought back to the stories she had read about Evelyn Harper, the first victim, and the tenants who came after. Each of them had been drawn into the same nightmare. Each of them had vanished. What had connected them? What tied her to this place? The questions swirled in her mind, unanswered, gnawing at her sanity. Then came the sound. It was faint at first, a soft tapping like fingernails on glass. Amanda froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the apartment. Her eyes darted to the mirror on the far wall, but it was empty. No reflection stared back at her, only the dim light of the room. The tapping stopped, replaced by a new noise. A faint, rhythmic thudding like footsteps coming from above. Amanda's heart raced. She lived on the top floor. There was no one above her. The thudding moved closer, each step reverberating through the ceiling, as if something impossibly heavy was making its way toward her. And then silence. Amanda sat motionless, every muscle in her body tense. She dared not move, dared not breathe. For a moment, she thought it was over. But then the phone rang. The sound was deafening, piercing through the quiet like a scream. Amanda flinched, her hands flying to her ears as if to block it out. But the ringing continued, relentless, demanding. She stared at the phone, her mind screaming at her to leave it, to run, to do anything but answer. Yet, she found herself crawling toward it, her body moving against her will. With trembling hands, she picked up the receiver. She didn't say anything this time. She just listened. At first, there was only static, faint and crackling. Then came the voice, cold and familiar. Amanda, it said, her name drawn out like a hiss. You can't ignore me. Midnight will come again. Tears streamed down her face. What do you want from me? She whispered, her voice breaking. The voice laughed, a sound that made her skin crawl. It's not about what I want. It's about what you've given. Your choice has sealed your fate. Before Amanda could respond, the static grew louder, and the voice was joined by others. Dozens of voices, some whispering, some screaming, some laughing. The cacophony filled her head, drowning out her thoughts, suffocating her. She dropped the receiver, but the voices didn't stop. They were inside her mind now, echoing through her skull, relentless. The lights in the apartment flickered, then went out completely. Amanda was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the clock on the wall. It was 12:15. She had survived another midnight. But for how long? The voices faded, leaving a chilling silence in their wake. Amanda sat in the darkness, her body shaking, her mind reeling. The phone lay on the floor, the receiver dangling, swaying slightly as if moved by an unseen hand. She stared at it, her fear giving way to a sinking realization. There was no escaping this. As the hours passed, Amanda remained in the same spot, too terrified to move. When dawn finally broke, the light creeping through the curtains did little to dispel the darkness that lingered in her mind. The phone didn't ring again, but its presence loomed, a constant reminder of what awaited her. Days turned into weeks, and Amanda's life became a blur of fear and sleepless nights. She tried to leave the apartment, but every time she stepped outside, she felt an invisible force pulling her back, tightening around her like a noose. The world outside seemed distant, unreal. Her existence was confined to the apartment and the terror that came with each passing midnight. One night, as the clock neared 12 o'clock, Amanda sat by the phone, her hands trembling. She no longer had the strength to fight. The ringing began, sharp and shrill, cutting through the silence like a blade. This time, she didn't hesitate. She picked up the receiver, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her. "I'm ready," she said. The voice on the other end chuckled, a sound that sent shivers down her spine. "Good," it said. "Let's begin." The line went dead, and the lights in the apartment flickered once more. Amanda closed her eyes, bracing herself for what was to come. Midnight had come again, and it always would. What do you think happened to Amanda? Why couldn't she escape the calls? Share your theories in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell, because midnight always comes, and you won't want to miss the next story.